Hello, my dear literature enthusiasts, lovers of words, symbols, and stories that go deeper than the surface. I can't tell you how good it feels to have you here with me again, sharing this quiet little corner where we look at films not just as entertainment, but as texts, layered and pulsing with meaning. Before we begin, I'll gently remind you, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe, not out of obligation, but because it keeps this little community of thoughtful explorers alive. And just so we're clear, what you're about to hear is not a real movie review in the traditional sense. It's a kind of intellectual meditation, a theoretical and critical exploration meant for those of us who come to movies the way others come to books, with pens in hand, hearts open, and curiosity leading the way. The film I'll be reflecting on tonight is Weapons 2025, and I want to take you on a journey through it, as though we were talking long after midnight, sharing thoughts in a way that feels both scholarly and intimate. I have to tell you, my relationship with this movie is not purely cinematic. It's personal, almost unsettlingly so. The very first time I heard about it, something in the back of my mind stirred, as if the title itself was already speaking in metaphors. Weapons, plural, blunt, sharp, visible, invisible. Aren't we all carrying them? I don't mean knives or guns, but the words we hurl, the silences we deploy, the griefs we hold like grenades, the traumas we hand down like heirlooms. Watching this film was like watching those unspoken truths come to life, projected larger than I could contain, yet still whispering to me in the quiet recesses of my own experiences. The story it tells is not linear, and that's part of what makes it so compelling. It unfolds almost like fragments of memory stitched together with thread that feels too fragile to hold. What struck me immediately was how familiar it all felt. Not because I've lived the plot itself, but because I've lived its emotional undertones. You know how sometimes a film seems to find you at the exact moment you're ready to hear what it has to say? That was my experience. I had been wrestling with questions about violence, not just physical, but emotional, systemic, even generational. And then here came this narrative, confronting me not with answers but with reflections demanding I look at myself, my history, and even my country in ways I wasn't sure I was ready for. At its heart, the film revolves around a small community, fractured by forces both within and without. On the surface, you could call it a thriller. It has that pulse, that sense of unease where even silence feels dangerous. But underneath, it's a meditation on fear, on the hidden tensions that eat away at ordinary lives, and on how people carry the burden of violence whether they choose to or not. There are several characters, each caught in webs that overlap like concentric circles. What I found remarkable was how their stories felt less like separate threads and more like echoes, different voices repeating the same questions in different registers. The plot, at least in the beginning, tempts you into thinking it's straightforward. A shocking incident shakes the community, a moment that at first feels isolated but slowly reveals itself as connected to a series of hidden truths. We follow different characters, some young, some old, some guilty, some innocent, and watch as their lives intersect. There's a teenage boy, restless and raw, who reminded me of my own restless years, when anger seemed to be the only language the world could understand. There's a grieving parent, haunted not just by what's been lost, but by what was never spoken, never healed. And there's the quiet observer, the one who tries to stitch together meaning from the fragments, who felt like a stand-in for anyone who's ever sat in a theater or turned the pages of a novel, trying desperately to make sense of chaos. What makes the narrative gripping is not just what happens, but how it unfolds. There are layers, moments that first appear to be random, but later resurface in startling ways, reframed by new context. One scene in particular stays with me. A simple dinner table conversation, nothing extraordinary at first glance. But the way the camera lingers, the way a phrase is repeated with just enough hesitation, it tells you something dangerous is brewing beneath the surface. Later, when the consequences of that moment unfold, I found myself almost gasping, realizing how carefully I had been led without even noticing. Of course, the film doesn't shy away from twists. They're not the cheap kind. not the sort meant only to shock. Instead, they're revelations that force you to reevaluate everything you thought you understood. One of the central mysteries, it's hard not to give too much away, centers around the true nature of a violent act. Who committed it? Why it happened? What it reveals about the community? These questions shift again and again as the story peels back its layers. I remember feeling, at one point, almost dizzy, as if the ground beneath me was tilting. And yet, rather than leaving me disoriented, it left me sharper, more awake, as though the film was demanding I pay attention not just to the story, but to the ways stories are told. What's extraordinary is how the narrative uses time. It doesn't unfold chronologically, but bends and fractures, much like memory itself. Sometimes we see the aftermath before we understand the cause. Sometimes a scene repeats, shown from another perspective, and what we thought we knew collapses. It reminded me of the way trauma works, circling back, refusing to move in a neat line, demanding to be revisited until it's finally confronted. And isn't that exactly what art should do? Refuse to let us settle into complacency, force us to reckon with what we'd rather avoid. There's a symbolic undercurrent throughout the story that I couldn't stop thinking about. Objects, ordinary ones, take on the weight of weapons. A baseball bat in one scene is just a game, in another it's menace. A photograph first looks like nostalgia, then becomes evidence. Even silence itself becomes a weapon, perhaps the sharpest one. I thought about my own life, about how many times silence has cut deeper than words ever could. The film seems to suggest that weapons aren't always what we imagine. They're often the things we fail to recognize until it's too late. The more I watched, the more I realized the film isn't just about individuals, but about systems. About how violence seeps into the soil of a place, shaping everyone who walks upon it. There are references, subtle, but there, if you notice, to cycles of history, to the way societies normalize certain forms of brutality until they become invisible. One line, delivered almost casually, hit me harder than any explosion ever could. We inherit the wars we don't remember. I sat with that for a long time, thinking of my own family history, the unspoken traumas passed down like shadows. The beauty of the film is that it doesn't spoon-feed answers. Instead, it leaves space for interpretation, for debate, for argument even. Some viewers might see it as a critique of modern culture, others as a deeply personal tragedy, still others as a parable about human nature itself. For me, it was all of those things and more. It was a mirror reflecting both the weapons I carry and the ones I've endured. And of course, there are moments, those cinematic jolts, that I can't spoil but can tease. A quiet drive that turns into a nightmare. A confession that unravels more than it explains. An ending that doesn't so much resolve as it reverberates, leaving you unsettled, maybe even angry, but undeniably awake. Those moments are the reason I still believe in cinema's power to shake us, to demand our attention, to linger long after the credits roll. As the lights came up, I felt that familiar weight in my chest, the one I get after finishing a novel that mattered. It's not just the story, it's the echo of it, the way it burrows into your thoughts and keeps reshaping them. This film reminded me why I do this, why I sit with stories and dissect them like sacred texts. Because in the end, they are sacred in their own way. They're the myths of our time, the mirrors of our struggles, the whispers of our unspoken fears. And so, my friends, I invite you to sit with this one too. Not to watch it passively, but to wrestle with it, to argue with it, to let it provoke you. Because that's what literature does, and that's what the best films can do too. It all begins quietly, which is perhaps the most unsettling choice of all. A stillness hangs over the opening, the kind of silence that makes you uneasy because you sense something is already wrong. The camera doesn't rush. It lingers. On empty streets, on ordinary houses with curtains drawn, on the flicker of neon lights from a tire gas station. It feels less like a beginning and more like an aftermath, as though we've stepped into a world already bruised, waiting for us to notice the scars. That's the first thing that struck me, how ordinary everything looked, and how that ordinariness felt like a threat. We're introduced to a community that, at first glance, could be anywhere. Suburban homes, a high school with its posters peeling at the edges, a diner where coffee is poured endlessly, but no one seems particularly awake. These spaces are familiar, almost comfortingly so, yet the film never lets you relax. It reminds me of times in my own life when the surface seemed calm, but underneath, tension was gnawing. The kind you can't name, but can feel in the air. The first character we truly meet is a teenage boy, Eli. He's restless, his eyes sharp and tired at the same time, like he's already lived through too much for his age. The film doesn't romanticize him or paint him as a simple rebel. Instead, it invites us to watch him closely, to notice the way he moves through hallways, the way he avoids eye contact, the way he clenches his jaw when certain names are mentioned. At school, he's just another face in the crowd. But the way the camera follows him tells us he's going to matter more than anyone suspects. One of the earliest scenes that lodged itself in my memory is Eli sitting in his bedroom late at night, headphones on, staring at a blank screen. Not a movie, not a video game, just a glow of emptiness. His mother knocks softly, asks if he's okay, and he mutters something indistinct, enough to close the conversation, but not enough to convince. It reminded me of those years when I was younger, and everything I felt seemed too large to explain, so I retreated behind silence, thinking no one could possibly understand. Watching Eli, I saw that same refusal to speak, and it ached because I knew it wasn't emptiness behind his silence, but an overflow. From Eli, the story expands outward, introducing us to others in the town. There's Ava, a young woman in her 20s who works at the diner. She has this weariness about her, the kind that comes from living in a place that feels too small, too suffocating, yet being unable to leave. She notices Eli when he comes in one afternoon, watching him sit alone with a milkshake he barely touches. The two don't speak much, just glances exchanged, but the film makes you feel the invisible thread beginning to stretch between them. Then there's Mr. Haynes, a high school teacher whose kindness feels almost out of place in this landscape. He's patient, gentle, the kind of adult you can tell genuinely cares, though that caring sometimes feels futile. His scenes are subtle but telling. Moments where he asks Eli about an essay, moments where he pauses before answering a difficult question in class, moments where his gaze lingers too long on the news headlines about violence in other towns. He seems to sense something is building, though he can't articulate it, and that helpless awareness becomes part of the film's atmosphere. The first turning point arrives, not with an explosion of action, but with a discovery. A boy goes missing. Not Eli, not someone we know well, just another student at the high school. At first, the town treats it as a misunderstanding. Maybe he ran away, maybe he's hiding out with friends. But the unease creeps in, subtle but relentless. Parents start looking twice at their children. Teachers speak in hushed voices. Rumors curl through the hallways like smoke. Watching this, I thought of how fear spreads faster than fact, how communities often collapse under uncertainty long before truth arrives. Eli becomes tangled in this disappearance almost by accident. One afternoon, wandering through the wooded edges of town, he stumbles upon something he shouldn't. A backpack, torn, dirty, left behind as if dropped in a rush. He doesn't tell anyone, not at first. Instead, he hides it, stuffing it beneath his bed. This choice says everything about him. His mistrust of authority, his need to hold control over a world that constantly strips it away. I found myself torn between frustration and sympathy, recognizing in him that adolescent desire to hold secrets close because they make you feel powerful, even when they're too heavy to carry. The story deepens with the introduction of Ava's brother, Luke. He's older, rougher, a figure who moves through the town with a certain menace. He's not painted as a villain outright, but there's something about him that unsettles. He's the kind of person who says just enough to make you doubt his intentions, who smiles at the wrong times, whose presence in a room changes its temperature. When Eli crosses paths with Luke, the tension sharpens. They circle each other in a way that feels dangerous, like two flints waiting to spark. What makes the film so compelling here is how it refuses to give clear answers. Is Luke connected to the missing boy? Is Eli? Or is the danger something larger, woven through the town itself? The ambiguity isn't frustrating. It's captivating because it mirrors real life. Rarely do we know the full picture. We only sense fragments, hints, suspicions. One of the most haunting sequences occurs when Eli finally confides in Ava about the backpack. They sit in her car, parked on the edge of town, the headlights cutting into the dark. He pulls the bag from beneath his hoodie and places it between them. The silence stretches. Ava doesn't ask the obvious questions, not right away. Instead, she just stares at it, as though the object itself carries a weight she's not ready to touch. Eventually, she whispers, "You should have told someone." But her tone isn't scolding, it's scared. That distinction lingers. The tension builds further as the town holds a meeting in the school gymnasium. Parents, teachers, local officials, they gather to discuss the missing student. It's a scene that feels almost mundane, the kind of gathering we've all sat through at some point. Yet under the film's lens, it becomes electric. People argue. Accusations fly. Fear twists into anger. At one point, Mr. Haynes stands and tries to calm the crowd, but his voice is drowned out. What struck me most was how the camera cuts to Eli, sitting near the back, clutching his fists. He knows something no one else does, and the burden of that knowledge is eating him alive. It's during this meeting that another revelation surfaces. Someone brings up a past incident. Another disappearance, years ago, swept quietly under the rug. The room shifts. Whispers ripple through the crowd. Suddenly, the narrative isn't about one missing boy. It's about a pattern, a wound the town never acknowledged. This is the moment when the story begins to widen, to hint that what's happening now isn't isolated but part of something darker, something systemic. I remember feeling a chill at this point, because the parallels to real life were unmistakable. How often do communities bury their traumas until they resurface with sharper teeth? From here, the relationships between characters begin to fray. Ava becomes more protective of Eli, sensing he's caught in something dangerous, though she doesn't fully understand what. Luke grows more volatile, his temper flaring in ways that suggest he knows more than he admits. Mr. Haynes becomes almost obsessive, lingering after class to talk to Eli, trying to draw out what's hidden behind his silence. And Eli himself begins to unravel. His dreams grow darker, his behavior more erratic. The film captures this unraveling beautifully, with fragmented visuals, disjointed sounds, moments where time itself seems to bend. The climax of this portion arrives with another disappearance, this time closer to Eli. A classmate he occasionally spoke to, someone who once lent him a pencil, vanishes. It's enough to push him over the edge. He takes the backpack he's been hiding and decides to confront Luke directly. What follows is a confrontation that doesn't end in violence, but in ambiguity. Luke denies involvement, but his words are slippery, his tone mocking. He leaves Eli more confused than before, more desperate to find clarity in a world that refuses to offer it. By the time this section closes, the town is no longer simply afraid. It's fractured. Trust erodes. Neighbors eye each other with suspicion. Parents pull their children closer, even as those children push them away. Eli stands at the center of it all, a boy with too many secrets, a boy caught between silence and confession, a boy who seems to carry the story's weight on his narrow shoulders. Watching him, I felt both protective and powerless, as though I were witnessing not just a character on screen, but a reflection of every young person burdened with more than they can carry. And so the story leaves us here, suspended in unease. Questions swirl unanswered. Tensions thicken. The sense of inevitability grows, yet we don't know where it will lead. What we do know, however, is that the quiet town we first stepped into is gone, replaced by something darker, more dangerous, and irrevocably changed. It doesn't take long before the atmosphere that was already tense begins to feel unbearable. The town itself seems to pulse with unease, like every street corner and every whispered conversation carries the weight of secrets too dangerous to say out loud. People are still searching for answers, but it's no longer about finding the truth. It's about protecting themselves from it. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Fear no longer unites, it divides. Eli is no exception. He's drawn deeper into this spiral, and though he tries to hold himself together, you can feel his grip loosening. The backpack under his bed, the one he showed Ava, becomes less an object and more a symbol, almost haunting him. The longer he hides it, the heavier it feels, until even silence starts to betray him. His mother notices he's not sleeping, that his hands shake sometimes, that his temper flares in ways it didn't before. She presses him, gently at first, then more urgently, but he resists. Watching those scenes, I couldn't help but think of how often the people we love most are the ones we push away when we're drowning. Meanwhile, Ava finds herself caught in an impossible position. She wants to protect Eli, but her brother Luke keeps creeping further into the shadows of suspicion. It's the way he lingers at night, the conversation she overhears, the cryptic comments he makes. She begins to suspect he knows something, maybe even more than Eli does, but confronting him feels like walking in a fire. Still, she tries. One night, in their small, dimly lit kitchen, she asks him directly, "Did you have anything to do with that boy?" His response isn't denial, not exactly. Instead, he laughs, a low, unsettling laugh that doesn't confirm but doesn't comfort either. Ava's face in that moment is unforgettable, a mix of fear, resignation, and something like grief, as though she's realizing she doesn't know her brother at all. The community fractures further when another body is found. Not the missing classmate, not the first boy, but someone unexpected. A local man, known for little more than sitting on his porch and drinking too much, is discovered dead in the woods. At first, it seems unrelated, but soon the whispers start again. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he saw something. The speculation spreads like wildfire, and suddenly every person in town becomes both suspect and victim in the eyes of their neighbors. Eli's breaking point arrives quietly, not with a scream, but with a confession. He finally tells Mr. Haynes about the backpack. The scene is intimate, taking place after school in an empty classroom. Eli sits hunched over a desk, the bag at his feet, his voice trembling as he admits he found it weeks ago. Mr. Haynes listens with a patience that feels both heartbreaking and heroic. He doesn't scold, doesn't panic. Instead, he says, "You did the right thing now." But Eli shakes his head. He doesn't believe it. The weight of waiting too long, of holding too much alone, has already crushed him. The discovery of the backpack shifts everything. Suddenly, the police are more present, combing the woods, questioning students, try to piece together a puzzle that seems to rearrange itself every time they get close. For the first time, Eli is forced into the spotlight, his name circulating among his peers, his silence scrutinized. It's excruciating to watch because the film doesn't dramatize his pain. It simply shows it, raw and unadorned. His isolation deepens, even as the town grows louder around him. What follows is one of the film's most haunting sequences, a dreamlike montage where Eli wanders through the empty school at night. The halls stretch endlessly, lockers slam shut on their own, whispers echo from unseen mouths. It's surreal, almost supernatural, but it feels less like a dream and more like a manifestation of his guilt and fear. When he wakes, drenched in sweat, the viewer is left wondering whether it was only a nightmare or something more. The tension between Eli and Luke finally explodes when they meet again in a desolate parking lot. This time, Eli isn't asking questions. He's demanding answers. Luke, however, plays his cruelest game yet, taunting him with half-truths and insinuations. "You think you know what's going on," he says, "but you're just another pawn." It's a line that reverberates through the story, because it makes you question everything. Who is in control here? Who's pulling the strings? The confrontation ends without violence, but it leaves Eli shaken, more uncertain than ever. Ava, sensing that the danger is escalating, makes her own bold move. She approaches the police, not with evidence, but with intuition, telling them to look closer at Luke. It's an act of both courage and desperation, and it doesn't go unnoticed. Luke finds out, of course, and the rift between them becomes irreparable. Their sibling bond, already frayed, finally snaps. Watching that, I thought of how betrayal sometimes comes not from hatred, but from the desperate attempt to save someone else. Ava's choice is rooted in love, but it cost her everything with her brother. As the search intensifies, the truth begins to surface in fragments, never all at once. The missing students, the dead man, the backpack, all of it connects, but not in the way anyone expects. The film refuses easy resolutions. Instead, it layers revelation upon revelation, each one both clarifying and complicating what came before. And at the center of it all is Eli, who slowly realizes that his role in this story is larger than he ever imagined. He's not just a bystander. He's the key. The climax arrives in a storm, literally and metaphorically. Rain lashes down as the town gathers for what was meant to be a vigil, a show of unity in the face of fear. Instead, it becomes the setting for everything to unravel. Tensions boil over. Accusations are shouted. And in the chaos, Eli finally steps forward, the weight of his silence too heavy to bear. He speaks, not everything, not perfectly, but enough to crack the facade that's held the town together. His words are messy, stumbling, but they carry a truth no one can ignore. It's during this storm that the final twist lands. The disappearances weren't random, nor were they the work of a lone monster. They were the product of a network of complicity, a tangle of people who looked the other way, who kept secrets, who allowed darkness to spread because acknowledging it would have shattered their comfort. The true horror isn't just in the acts themselves, but in the silence that surrounded them. That revelation hit me harder than any jump scare or violent twist could have. It felt real, painfully real, because how often do we see the same thing in our own world? The resolution isn't neat. This isn't the kind of story that ties everything up with a bow. The missing students are found, not all alive, not all whole, but the truth is dragged into the light. Luke's involvement is confirmed, though he's revealed not as a mastermind, but as another victim of a larger system, a cog in a machine of silence and denial. Ava is left to pick up the pieces, her loyalty to her brother forever fractured, but her courage undeniable. Mr. Haynes, who tried so hard to protect his students, is broken by the realization that his efforts weren't enough. And Eli stands in the wreckage, changed. He's no hero in the traditional sense, no triumphant figure walking away with the day saved. Instead, he's a boy scarred by truth, older now in ways that have nothing to do with years. Yet there's a quiet strength in him, a resilience born from having faced the darkness head-on. The final shot lingers on his face, eyes searching, not for answers anymore, but for a way to keep living in a world where answers aren't simple. What stays with me most isn't the twists or the climactic storm, but the moments of silence afterward. The stillness of a community forced to confront itself, the hush of a boy finally speaking, the echo of words that can't be unsaid. It's unsettling, heartbreaking, but also strangely hopeful. Because even though the story ends in fracture, there's a sense that something new might grow from the ruins. Not healing yet, not forgiveness, but the fragile beginnings of honesty. And that, I think, is what makes this film so hauntingly powerful. It doesn't offer the comfort of closure. It offers the challenge of truth. And once you've seen it, you can't look away. There are stories where characters feel like distant figures, paper dolls moved around for the sake of plot. And then there are stories like this one, where the characters seem to seep into your bloodstream, where you carry them with you long after the credits fade. Each one feels less like a creation and more like someone you've known, or perhaps someone you've feared becoming. What struck me most as I watched was not just who they were in the story, but how they mirrored pieces of real people I've encountered in my own life. At the center stands Eli. It's impossible to talk about this story without acknowledging how profoundly he carries its weight. He begins as a boy, quiet and watchful, the sort of person who blends into the background until the world insists on pulling him into its center. There's a fragility about him, but not the kind that makes you doubt his strength, more the kind that makes you ache to protect him. Watching Eli is like remembering your own younger self in moments of fear, when the world seemed too heavy and your shoulders too narrow. Eli's silence is his most defining trait, but it isn't emptiness. It's loaded, tense, vibrating with things unsaid. Every scene where he hesitates to speak feels like a test of endurance, both for him and for us. I think about how often silence is misinterpreted as cowardice, as indifference, when in reality, it's often the heaviest burden. Eli carries secrets not because he wants to, but because he feels trapped between revelation and destruction. In him, I saw that terrifying truth of adolescence, that sometimes children are forced to carry adult-sized burdens with no one to guide them through. What I admire most about Eli as a character is how the film refuses to romanticize his struggle. He doesn't transform into a bold, charismatic leader. He doesn't deliver perfectly timed speeches that shift the tide. His growth is quieter, jagged, messy. When he finally speaks, it isn't triumphant. It's halting, broken, imperfect. It's real. And that's what makes him unforgettable. His humanity isn't smoothed over for comfort. It's raw, authentic, and painfully true. Standing beside him, though often just beyond reach, is Ava. She's the kind of character who could have easily slipped into the archetype of the supportive friend, but the film grants her far more complexity. Ava is brave, yes, but her bravery isn't reckless. It's the kind born from desperation, from loving someone so much you're willing to put yourself in danger for them. She embodies the tension of loyalty, torn between protecting Eli and confronting her own brother, Luke. Watching her navigate that line is agonizing because there's no choice that leaves her whole. What fascinates me most about Ava is her quiet defiance. She doesn't shout, doesn't grandstand. Instead, she moves through the story with this steady determination, like someone who's long known the world won't protect her and has decided she'll do the protecting herself. I found myself thinking of people in my own life, friends who seemed ordinary until circumstances forced them to become anchors, holding others steady even while trembling inside. Ava reminded me of them. Her courage is subtle but fierce, and in many ways, it saves the story from collapsing under its own darkness. And then there's Luke. If Eli carries the story's heart and Ava carries its spine, Luke is its fracture, the jagged break that spreads through everything. From the moment he appears, there's something unsettling about him. Not overtly monstrous, but disquieting in his casualness. His cruelty isn't flamboyant. It's quiet, calculated, almost playful. That's what makes him terrifying. Luke represents the kind of person who thrives on power, not by wielding it openly, but by keeping others uncertain. His smirks, his half-answers, his taunts, they're all weapons sharper than any blade. But Luke is not simple. The film doesn't let us dismiss him as merely a villain. There are moments, brief but unforgettable, where you catch glimpses of something broken beneath his armor. The way he avoids Ava's eyes when she asks him hard questions, the flicker of regret when Eli pushes him for answers, the slight tremor in his hands in a late-night scene. All of it hints at someone who is both perpetrator and victim. That duality unsettled me. It forces you to sit with the discomfort of realizing that monsters are rarely born whole. They're shaped, twisted by circumstances, by silence, by systems that feed on complicity. Mr. Haynes is another figure who lingers with me. Teachers in stories like this often play either savior or scapegoat, but here, he's something else entirely. He's deeply human, flawed, but achingly sincere in his attempts to help. What makes him stand out is his patience. The way he listens to Eli without pushing too hard, the way he tries to create a safe space even in the midst of chaos. And yet, his limits are clear. He cannot protect his students from the world outside the classroom, and that knowledge seems to crush him. There's one scene, after Eli finally confides in him, where Haynes sits alone at his desk, his face buried in his hands. That image broke me, because it captured something so rare, the devastation of adults who realize they cannot shield the young from pain, no matter how much they want to. beyond the central quartet, the community itself emerges as a kind of collective character. The town breathes with suspicion, exhales with denial, and convulses with anger. It's not one person but many, yet it moves with a singular energy, fear. The whispers, the glances, the hurried conversations in grocery store aisles. All of it builds a portrait of how communities can both nurture and destroy. Watching the town unravel felt disturbingly familiar, because I've seen versions of it before. How fear can spread faster than truth, how silence can become complicity, how unity often shatters under pressure. The film captures that truth with chilling precision. There's also Eli's mother, a quieter presence but no less important. She isn't given grand monologues or sweeping arcs, but her role is vital. She embodies the love of a parent who knows something is wrong but can't quite grasp what. Her worry manifests in small ways. Watching him too closely, trying to coax him into talking, holding his hand a little too tightly. It reminded me of how often parental love is expressed not in words, but in gestures, in the constant hum of presence. Her inability to fully reach Eli doesn't make her weak. It makes her heartbreakingly human. Even the unnamed characters, the townspeople, the police, the classmates, add layers to the story. They represent the spectrum of responses to fear, denial, aggression, apathy, desperation. Taken together, they create the suffocating atmosphere that traps Eli, Ava, and Luke. In that way, the film doesn't let us believe that individuals act in isolation. Everyone contributes, whether through action or inaction, to the creation of the tragedy. What's remarkable is how the film resists caricature. No one is purely good or purely evil. Even Luke, with all his cruelty, is revealed to be shaped by forces beyond him. Even Mr. Haynes, with all his kindness, is powerless to prevent disaster. That complexity lingers because it mirrors life. People are contradictions. They wound and heal, betray and protect, destroy and save, often in the same breath. As I think back on these characters, I realize what makes them unforgettable isn't just what they do, but how much of ourselves we see in them. Eli embodies the weight of silence many of us have carried. Ava represents the courage we aspire to when protecting others. Luke forces us to confront the darkness that can grow in the absence of light. Mr. Haynes shows us the limits of even the most earnest care. And the town reflects the uncomfortable truth that fear can make us complicit in harm. Together, they weave a story that isn't just about mystery or tragedy. It's about the human condition itself. Watching them was like holding up a mirror to the most fragile, the most resilient, and the most unsettling parts of ourselves. And maybe that's why they stay with me still. Because once you've seen them, once you've recognized those echoes of humanity, you can't turn away. There's something intoxicating about discovering what lies beneath the surface of a film you've already absorbed. We watch, we feel, we carry the story with us, but then we stumble upon those little scraps of truth, those odd details that happen when the cameras weren't rolling or when decisions were made in dimly lit production rooms. And suddenly the movie becomes even richer, stranger, more alive. With this film, those behind-the-scenes fragments aren't just amusing. They feel uncanny, as if the story was haunted not only within its narrative but in the very act of bringing it into being. The first thing that comes to mind is how the script itself was discovered. You might think such a sharp, layered story was the result of months of polished studio pitches, carefully outlined treatments, and committee meetings. But the truth is far stranger. The original draft was found, quite literally, forgotten in a drawer of an old typewriter in a rented writing cabin. The screenwriter had abandoned it years before, convinced it was too bleak, too raw, too close to some personal shadows they weren't ready to face. When the draft resurfaced, it was barely legible, full of coffee stains, cigarette burns, and handwritten scribbles in the margins. The producers claim they felt a chill as they read it, as if they were stumbling upon something they weren't meant to see. That alone gave the film an aura of mystery from the very beginning. But perhaps the most unsettling detail is that several moments in the story were not written at all. They were accidents that happened on set, later folded into the narrative as though fate itself had guided them. One scene, in particular, where Eli drops a glass and it shatters into 1,000 pieces, wasn't scripted. The actor was so nervous during the take that his hands trembled and the glass slipped. Instead of breaking character, he stared at the shards on the ground with such haunted intensity that the director whispered to the crew to keep rolling. That accidental moment became one of the film's most symbolic images. Silence breaking into sharp fragments, the fragility of innocence shattered beyond repair. Watching it in the final cut, you'd never guess it was an accident. Strange coincidences seemed to shadow the production. On 3 separate occasions, filming was interrupted by sudden power outages, always during the most emotionally charged scenes. The crew laughed nervously at first, blaming the old wiring of the soundstage. But after the 3rd time, when the blackout happened in the exact moment Eli was supposed to reveal a devastating truth, some began to whisper about curses. One lighting technician admitted later that he refused to be on set without a small charm his grandmother had given him, a tiny iron key meant to ward off bad spirits. Whether it worked or not, no one knows, but the superstition spread quickly, and soon half the crew had lucky tokens dangling from their belts or tucked into their pockets. Even the casting process carried its own air of strangeness. The role of Luke, for example, nearly went to a very different actor, someone well-known, handsome, charismatic. It might have changed the entire dynamic of the story. But when the director sat down with him, she realized immediately it wouldn't work. The polished charm felt wrong. Instead, she turned to a young actor with no major credits, someone who arrived late to the audition, disheveled and distracted, muttering lines under his breath as though he were talking to ghosts. The casting team almost dismissed him as unprofessional, but the moment he looked up and delivered his first line, the room went silent. He had a presence that was unnerving, unpolished, unpredictable. The director later admitted she felt both frightened and captivated. That rawness, that dangerous unpredictability, is what gave Luke his terrifying authenticity. There are stories, too, about how deeply the actors immersed themselves in their roles, sometimes to unsettling degrees. The boy who played Eli stopped speaking outside of scenes for nearly 2 weeks. His mother, who stayed with him on set, said he carried a notebook everywhere and only wrote his thoughts instead of saying them out loud. The director, concerned, asked him why. His answer was simple: because Eli wouldn't. That kind of devotion from someone so young left the adults torn between awe and worry. When the film wrapped, it took months for him to return to his usual chatter, and he later admitted in an interview that sometimes he still dreams in silence, as though Eli is whispering through him. Not all the strange occurrences were so somber, though. There were moments of bizarre hilarity, little pockets of absurdity that became part of the production's legend. During one night shoot, a stray dog wandered onto the set and refused to leave. No matter how many times they tried to coax it away, it kept circling the actors, as if determined to be part of the scene. Finally, the director gave in and let it stay in the background. If you look closely during that sequence, you can just barely spot it, trotting past a window at the exact moment Luke delivers one of his most chilling lines. Fans who noticed have since spun wild theories about the ghost dog, claiming it was a hidden metaphor planted by the filmmakers. In reality, it was just a stubborn mutt with impeccable timing. Then there was the curious case of the recurring sound. During editing, the sound team kept picking up faint whispers on the audio tracks. Nothing intelligible, just low murmurs that seemed to echo beneath the dialogue. At first, they assumed it was interference from nearby radio frequencies. But when they tried to trace it, they found nothing. Stranger still, the whispers only appeared in scenes involving Eli, never in any others. Eventually, they scrubbed the tracks clean, but not before several editors admitted the sounds gave them nightmares. One described it as the kind of voice you don't hear with your ears, but with your bones. That detail never made it into press releases, but among crew members, it became one of the strangest and most unsettling memories of the project. Of course, not every fact is eerie. Some are simply delightful in their oddness. For instance, The director had a peculiar ritual before shooting any major scene. She would gather the cast and crew in a circle, have them close their eyes, and hum a single note together for 30 seconds. It was her way of aligning the group. She explained of creating a shared rhythm. At first, everyone felt awkward, self-conscious. But soon it became a beloved tradition. By the end of filming, crew members said those humming circles felt almost sacred, like they were binding the group together in a way words couldn't. Perhaps that ritual is part of why the film feels so emotionally unified, because the people making it had literally found a way to harmonize with one another. Another little-known detail lies in the costuming. The wardrobe team went to extraordinary lengths to ensure authenticity, even in ways no one would ever consciously notice. For Eli's clothing, they deliberately wore down the fabrics, washing and rewashing them until they looked naturally faded, as though they had lived a real life before arriving on screen. They even stitched tiny tears and repaired them, creating the illusion of a mother's careful mending. Luke's costumes, on the other hand, were chosen with almost surgical precision. Sharp lines, darker tones, textures that reflected hardness. It's the kind of thing you wouldn't pick up on while watching, but subconsciously it seeps in, shaping how you feel about the characters before they even speak. There's also the fascinating trivia about the town itself. Many assumed the setting was built on a soundstage, but in truth, most of it was shot in a nearly abandoned community that had once thrived around a factory, now long shut down. The production team chose it because of its eerie stillness. Houses standing but hollow, streets intact but empty. Locals said the place was haunted by the memories of what it used to be. And perhaps that energy bled into the film, giving the setting its uncanny authenticity. A few crew members claimed they heard footsteps in houses that were supposed to be empty or saw curtains flutter in rooms with no open windows. Whether real or imagined, the atmosphere seeped into every frame. Even the editing process carried its own strangeness. At one point, an entire sequence disappeared from the digital files, gone without explanation. Backup drives were checked, cloud servers scoured, but the footage could not be found. After weeks of searching, the team had no choice but to reshoot. Months later, the lost footage mysteriously reappeared on a drive that had already been wiped clean. To this day, no one has an explanation. The director kept a copy of it in her personal archive, calling it her phantom reel. It said it contains subtle differences, expressions that don't quite match, lines delivered with slightly different intonations, as though the actors had unknowingly created an alternate version of their own film. And then there's the story of the final shot. Without giving too much away, I'll just say it's a moment of devastating stillness. What few people know is that the actor playing Eli didn't know the camera was still rolling. The director deliberately withheld the call of cut, allowing him to sit in silence, believing the scene had ended. What we see on screen, then, isn't acting. It's him, caught in a moment of unguarded vulnerability, staring into the void of what his character had endured. That choice transformed the ending into something unforgettable, something that feels almost too raw to be fiction. All of these oddities, these whispered stories, make the film feel less like a piece of entertainment and more like something conjured, coaxed into existence with equal parts intention and accident. I find myself fascinated not just by what we see on screen, but by the ghosts of what lingered behind it. The accidents that became art, the coincidences that became symbolism, the strangeness that seemed to haunt the production from beginning to end. And maybe that's what I love most about these behind-the-scenes facts. They remind us that films aren't sterile constructions. They're living organisms, shaped by chaos as much as control. They're haunted by the fingerprints of everyone who touched them, from the director humming in circles to the boy who forgot how to speak, from the stubborn stray dog to the whispers in the audio tracks. All of it, the eerie and the absurd, becomes part of the story's DNA. And somehow, knowing all this makes the film even richer, even stranger, even more alive. It's always the small details that carry the most weight. When I think back to the moments that define the story, the ones that linger long after the credits, I find myself drawn not to the explosions or the overt climaxes, but to those quieter beats where time seemed to stop and the screen felt like a mirror. That's where the real power of this film lies, in its ability to take the personal and stretch it until it becomes universal. And if we're going to unravel it critically, I think we have to start by remembering how the events didn't just happen. They unfolded in ways that forced us to sit with our own discomfort, to look at truths we'd rather glance away from. One of the earliest pivotal moments comes when Eli, the boy at the story's center, witnesses something that no child should ever have to bear. What fascinates me about this scene, from a critical perspective, isn't just what happens, but how it's framed. We don't see everything directly. Instead, the camera lingers on his face, his eyes widening, his mouth trembling as if he's swallowing a scream. This choice removes spectacle from the event and instead roots it in emotional reality. For the audience, it's an invitation into subjectivity. We aren't asked to consume violence as entertainment, but to feel its weight through a child's perception. In that single choice, the film establishes its moral compass. Spectacle doesn't matter here. The human soul does. When critics talk about ethical filmmaking, this is exactly the kind of moment they're referring to. We've grown so used to movies exploiting trauma for shock value that it's almost disarming when a director denies us that voyeurism. Instead, we're left with silence and implication, forced to fill in the blanks with our own imagination. And, as is often the case, what we imagine is far more haunting than anything shown outright. In that sense, the event doesn't just advance the plot. It becomes a mirror reflecting our own complicity as viewers. We're reminded that even watching, even sitting safely in the dark, has its own moral weight. Later, as the story builds, another significant moment emerges. Eli's first encounter with Luke, the man whose presence seems to shadow the narrative like an omen. On the surface, it's just a meeting, two characters crossing paths. But if you look at the way it's staged, it carries enormous symbolic heft. The scene unfolds in a liminal space, half in shadow, half in light, and the framing positions Eli at a literal lower angle, gazing upward while Luke looms. Critics often speak of power dynamics in visual storytelling, and here it couldn't be clearer. The boy, vulnerable and searching, versus the man who embodies something darker, almost predatory. But what elevates this event isn't just its symbolism. It's the ambiguity layered into Luke's performance. He isn't a cartoonish villain twirling his mustache. He speaks softly, almost kindly, his words dripping with a strange mixture of tenderness and menace. That contradiction unsettles us because it refuses to let us categorize him easily. This is where the film brushes against one of its deepest themes, the dangerous seduction of destructive forces. Evil doesn't always announce itself with snarls and fangs. Sometimes it comes cloaked in comfort, in the familiar tone of someone who seems to understand. Watching the scene unfold, I couldn't help but think of how. Often in life, we've all been drawn towards something we knew, deep down, wasn't safe but felt irresistible all the same. What fascinates me most is how this encounter reverberates throughout the rest of the story. Critics often talk about catalyst events, moments that set everything else into motion, and this is one of them. From here, Eli's world tilts off its axis. And for us as viewers, it tilts too. We're no longer just watching a child grow up. We're watching innocence rub against corruption, safety collide with danger. That collision, painful as it is, forms the heart of the film's impact. Of course, not all significant events are quiet. The story crescendos into scenes of rupture, where everything that has been bubbling beneath the surface finally spills over. One such moment comes when Eli, cornered by truth and fear, lashes out, not in violence, but in raw honesty. He confronts the people who should have protected him, who failed him, and his words come like knives. It's not just a plot development. It's a thematic revelation. What we witness here is the breaking of silence, the reclamation of voice. From a critical perspective, this event embodies one of the film's strongest motifs, silence versus speech. Throughout the story, Silence is both safety and suffocation. It protects Eli from immediate harm, but eats away at his spirit. When he finally speaks, it's messy, uncontrolled, devastating, but it's also liberating. In that moment, the film reminds us that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about naming, about pulling truth into the open no matter how ugly. And for me, watching that, I couldn't help but think of the times in life when I kept quiet for too long, when my silence felt like complicity. It's a scene that doesn't just belong to Eli. It belongs to all of us who have ever been too afraid to speak. The climax, when it comes, is both expected and startling. Critics often describe great climaxes as inevitable but unpredictable. You know it has to happen, yet when it does, it still knocks the breath out of you. That's exactly how this one works. Without giving away too much, it involves a confrontation between Eli and Luke that feels almost mythic in its intensity. What fascinates me is how the filmmakers avoided grandiose theatrics here. There are no sweeping orchestral scores, no choreographed brawls. Instead, the scene plays out in hushed tones, in a confined space, with minimal dialogue. The tension comes not from action, but from the unbearable weight of what's unspoken. Critically, this moment embodies the film's thematic essence. That true conflict isn't external, but internal. The real battle isn't between fists or weapons. It's between fear and courage, silence and voice, destruction and survival. By stripping the climax of spectacle, the filmmakers force us to confront that truth. And when the resolution comes, it's not triumphant in the traditional sense. It's quieter, more ambiguous, leaving us to grapple with what survival really means. Did Eli win? Perhaps. But at what cost? That question lingers, unresolved, gnawing at us long after the credits. From a reception standpoint, these events, and the way they're handled, are what gave the film its staying power. Some critics praised it as a masterpiece of restraint, a film that understands the difference between drama and melodrama. Others found it frustratingly ambiguous, yearning for clearer resolutions. But that divide itself is part of the film's impact. It refuses to spoon-feed us answers. Instead, it challenges us to wrestle with complexity, to accept that some wounds don't heal neatly, that some truths remain jagged. And then there are the smaller events, the quiet moments that don't advance the plot, but deepen the resonance. Like the recurring image of Eli watching shadows dance across his wall at night, as though haunted by presences he can't name. Or the fleeting tenderness between him and a friend, moments of laughter that feel stolen from a harsher world. Critics might call these lyrical interludes, but I think of them as breathing spaces, pauses that remind us what's at stake. Without them, the larger events wouldn't hit as hard. With them, we remember that amidst fear and violence, life still flickers, fragile but persistent. Taken together, the significant events of this film weave a tapestry of contrasts: silence and speech, innocence and corruption, destruction and resilience. Each moment is carefully crafted not just to tell a story, but to force us into reflection. And perhaps that's the greatest gift of this film. It doesn't let us remain passive. It demands that we feel, that we wrestle, that we question. I find myself thinking often about its emotional resonance, about the way it lingers not as a neat narrative, but as a haunting echo. For me, it connects to the broader truth of art itself, that its purpose isn't to provide answers, but to expand our capacity for empathy, to open us to experiences we might never live, but can still understand. Watching Eli's journey, I was reminded of my own vulnerabilities, my own silences, the moments I wished I'd spoken sooner, the moments I feared the shadows but still searched for light. That, to me, is the real measure of the film's success, not whether it entertains, but whether it transforms. And in that sense, every significant event, every carefully constructed scene contributes to something larger than plot. They create a landscape of emotion, a terrain of resonance that we wander long after the lights come up. It's unsettling, yes. It's not the kind of film you walk away from lightly. But maybe that's what makes it essential. It doesn't let you forget. It stays, like a ghost, like a whisper, asking quietly, "What do you carry, and when will you finally let it speak?" There's something about watching a movie that makes you forget, at least for a little while, that hundreds of people were working tirelessly behind the camera to bring it to life. But the beauty of looking deeper, of pulling back the curtain just a little, is realizing that every flicker of light, every hush of sound, every single beat of scene is the result of a choice, a conversation, and often a chaotic accident that somehow transformed into art. This film was no exception. If anything, the production itself was a story just as compelling as what we saw on the screen. From the very beginning, whispers around the set suggested that the director wanted to approach the entire project like a puzzle. Nothing was to be built in the usual order. They didn't start with a simple script-to-shoot translation. Instead, there were endless workshops, rehearsals, and long improvisational exercises where the actors weren't even given their full lines. The crew talked about how, for weeks, they'd gather in bare rehearsal spaces. No costumes, no props, just the actors and the director walking through emotions like explorers tracing a map in the dark. To an outsider, it probably looked like chaos, but those who were there said you could feel something forming, a rawness that later seeped into the final film. The cinematographer once joked in an interview that shooting this project felt less like filming a movie and more like capturing a storm without getting swept away. They used handheld cameras more often than planned, not because it was fashionable, but because it was the only way to keep up with the actors' energy. There was one day when the crew had planned a meticulously blocked scene, a slow dolly, a perfectly timed shift of focus. But the actors, caught in the momentum of their emotions, broke free from the marks on the floor. Instead of stopping, the camera operators simply followed, weaving through the set like dancers in their own right. When the director saw the footage, he scrapped the original plan entirely. That messy, imperfect, almost documentary-like shot became the backbone of the sequence. There's a kind of beauty in that chaos, isn't there? The sense that art happens not when you control every detail, but when you let life slip into the cracks. And the crew seemed to live in those cracks. They laughed often about how props disappear between takes, how sound engineers caught unexpected noises that ended up staying in the mix because they added texture. Once, while shooting a particularly intense night sequence, a dog from a nearby farm wandered onto the set. At first, everyone panicked. Continuity was ruined, timing was off. But instead of shooing it away, the director let the dog stay. It curled up quietly in the background, and its presence brought this unplanned tenderness to the scene. Later, when audiences saw it, they thought it was symbolic, a deliberate choice. Only those on set knew it was pure serendipity. Then there were the moments of tension. The production wasn't smooth sailing by any means. Weather was one of the fiercest enemies. They filmed in locations that looked stunning on screen, but were merciless to work in. Humid forests where equipment malfunctioned under dripping leaves, abandoned industrial spaces filled with dust that clogged lenses and lungs. There was one legendary day where the rain poured so relentlessly that the set flooded, and the crew had to wade through waist-high water to rescue gear. Instead of shutting down, the director decided to shoot anyway. Those rainy, chaotic shots, which weren't in the script at all, made it into the final cut and gave the film an eerie, almost mythic atmosphere. What was once a logistical nightmare turned into one of the most hauntingly beautiful sequences. And of course, there are always the personal stories, the quiet connections among cast and crew that never make it to the press kits, but form the heartbeat of a production. One crew member remembered how the lead actor, though immersed in heavy, emotional material all day, always took time to check in with the set dressers and lighting assistants. He would crack small jokes to lift the mood, or bring snacks to night shoots when exhaustion hung heavy. These little gestures kept morale alive, reminding everyone that beneath the exhaustion and creative pressure, they were still a family building something together. Interestingly, the music process was almost as unconventional as the filming itself. Instead of scoring after the footage was complete, the composer was brought on his set early. Musicians would sometimes sit in the corner during filming, experimenting with themes live as scenes unfolded. The actors later admitted that hearing those haunting notes while they performed, shaped their emotions in ways no direction could have. One actress recalled a moment where a soft melody played just as she entered a particularly painful scene. It broke her open, guiding her into a vulnerability she hadn't reached in rehearsal. That rawness stayed, captured forever on film, thanks not to lines in a script, but to the invisible hand of music. There were also delightful bits of trivia that only reveal themselves when you peer closely. For example, some of the props weren't props at all. Old family photographs used in one scene were actually contributed by crew members, giving the film an authenticity you can't fake. A torn jacket worn by Eli's character wasn't costume design, but an accident. He had snagged it on a nail between takes. Instead of replacing it, the wardrobe team kept it, realizing the imperfection mirrored his unraveling state. Even the graffiti scene on walls wasn't fabricated by set designers. It came from locals in the filming area, whose work was left untouched to honor the environment the crew was borrowing. Of course, no behind-the-scenes tale would be complete without some eccentric rituals. Rumor has it that before every major night shoot, the crew would gather around a single lantern, take a deep breath together, and let out a collective yell into the darkness. It wasn't planned. It started one night when frustration boiled over, but it became a tradition. That yell, echoing into the trees or across abandoned streets, became a kind of catharsis, a way of reminding themselves they were alive, united, and making something bigger than any one of them. From a production standpoint, the editing process carried its own strange mythology. The editor, known for an almost obsessive attention to detail, would work late into the night, often sleeping on the couch in the editing suite. One of the assistants said that sometimes, in the small hours of the morning, he'd splice a sequence together and then just sit there, weeping quietly. Not because it was sad necessarily, but because the pieces fit so perfectly it felt transcendent. That's the kind of devotion that shaped the film. Not efficiency or professionalism alone, but deep, almost spiritual surrender to the work. Looking back now, the production of this film feels like its own story of survival and serendipity. Every mishap became an opportunity, every obstacle a hidden gift. From dogs wandering into frame to flooded sets that birthed haunting imagery. From jackets tearing at the wrong time to rainstorms rewriting entire scenes. It seems like the universe itself wanted to play a role in shaping the narrative. And perhaps that's the magic of filmmaking. No matter how tightly you plan, the best art often comes from the accidents you don't see coming. And the fun facts, the little nuggets that fans love to collect, shine like constellations in the background of all this chaos. Did you know, for instance, that one of the most chilling lines in the film wasn't in the script at all? It came from an exhausted actor muttering under his breath between takes. The director heard it, stopped everything, and insisted it be written into the scene. Or that the final shot of the film, which feels so deliberate and meticulously composed, was captured spontaneously while testing lighting equipment at dawn. None of it was planned, and yet, without those moments, the film wouldn't resonate the way it does. For me, hearing these stories changes the way I watch the movie. Suddenly, every frame isn't just a crafted illusion. It's alive with memory, with the sweat and laughter of the people who made it possible. The production itself becomes part of the narrative, enriching the experience in ways most audiences will never realize. And maybe that's the real joy of peeling back the curtain. Recognizing that art isn't about perfection, but about persistence, collaboration, and the willingness to embrace imperfection until it becomes something beautiful. There are films where the setting feels like nothing more than wallpaper, a backdrop waiting patiently while the characters do the real work. And then there are films like this one, where the place itself is as alive as any of the people, breathing through every frame, shaping moods, bending destinies, and carrying secrets. If the characters were the heart of this story, the setting was undoubtedly its soul. From the earliest days of production, the director was obsessed with location. He didn't want stages built in a warehouse or green screens conjuring digital illusions. He wanted real places, places with scars and weathering, with histories that couldn't be faked. The hunt for those settings became a story in itself. Long drives down forgotten roads, scouting trips to abandoned factories, evenings spent walking through forests where the silence pressed so heavily you felt you were trespassing on something sacred. The director would sometimes pause in those places, close his eyes, and just listen. "Can you hear it?" he'd ask the crew, though most admitted later they weren't sure what they were supposed to be hearing. Maybe it was the echo of stories buried in the ground. One of the most hauntingly beautiful settings was the old industrial complex, where several pivotal scenes were filmed. Rusted metal beams reached skyward like the skeletons of some extinct creature, and light fell through shattered windows in fractured beams. The cinematographer loved this space. It gave him texture. When the actors walked across the cracked concrete, their footsteps rang with a hollow, metallic echo that no sound engineer could have manufactured. The dust, stirred by every movement, became its own kind of atmosphere, catching the shafts of light until the air seemed to shimmer with memory. Watching those moments later on screen, you'd never know half the crew was coughing between takes, battling the grit that lodged itself in their throats. But that discomfort was worth it because those images carried a weight, an authenticity you can't design in a studio. And then there was the forest, a sprawling, almost primeval tangle of trees and moss. It stretched across miles, its canopy swallowing sound. Filming there was treacherous. Equipment had to be hauled on foot, and storms arrived without warning. But the payoff was extraordinary. There's one particular sequence where the protagonist moves through the forest, and the light barely kisses the ground, filtering down in fragmented, trembling pools. It looks deliberate, like a master painter's hand arranging every shadow and beam. But the truth, whispered by the crew, is that nature itself did the work. The cinematographer confessed in an interview that he often felt more like a witness than a creator. His job was simply to frame what was already astonishing. The forest didn't need him. It already knew how to hold an audience captive. That same philosophy carried into how the film handled urban environments. Instead of slick, anonymous cityscapes, the director insisted on shooting in neighborhoods with personality, streets layered with graffiti, houses that bore the marks of generations, alleys that seemed to whisper their own stories after dark. There's a moment where the camera lingers on a broken swing, swaying in an abandoned playground. It lasts only a few seconds, almost a passing detail, but it burns into memory. That swing wasn't staged. The location scouts stumbled across it one afternoon, and the director instantly knew it belonged in the film. He once said in an interview, "It's not just about showing where the characters are, it's about showing what lingers when they're gone." That playground, with its chipped paint and rust, became a symbol for everything the story wanted to say about memory, loss, and the strange persistence of place. Cinematography carried the heavy responsibility of weaving these settings into mood and tone. The choices were meticulous, though you'd never notice at first because they feel so organic. For example, wide shots were used sparingly, only when the landscape itself was meant to overwhelm the character, reminding us of their smallness in a world far larger and older. Close-ups, by contrast, pulled us into intimacy, but even then, the background refused to disappear. It pressed close, blurred yet insistent, a constant reminder that the environment was always part of the equation. The interplay between sharpness and softness in the frame mirrored the film's themes. Clarity always arriving in fragments, never in totality. Color grading deserves its own mention. The palette shifted across the film in subtle but powerful ways. Early scenes hummed with earthy tones, warm browns, sunlit golds, hints of green, that grounded us in something natural and almost comforting. But as the story deepened, colors cooled, shadows lengthened, and the palette bled into blues and grays, until warmth felt like a memory we weren't sure we'd ever return to. Watching this transition unfold was like watching hope slip quietly out of reach. The film never shouted about it, never drew attention to the shift, but your body felt it, an unease creeping in, a tightening in the chest, as if the world itself was darkening along with the character's journey. And sound, Oh, sound was another character entirely. Not just the score, but the textures of the settings themselves. The forest carried the low hum of insects, the creak of branches and unseen winds, the distant crackle of something alive but hidden. The industrial ruins echoed with dripping water, groans of rusted metal shifting under its own weight, the hollow thunder of footsteps bouncing off cavernous spaces. These weren't incidental noises. They were chosen, amplified, folded carefully into the soundscape until they pulsed beneath the dialogue, feeding the atmosphere with a life of its own. Light, too, was used almost symbolically. Natural light dominated. The softness of dawn, the merciless glare of noon, the bruised skies of twilight. Artificial light appeared sparingly, often harsh, often alien, a contrast that drew sharp attention to itself. One memorable scene bathed the character in the glow of a flickering fluorescent bulb, the light cutting in and out, as if the environment itself were unsure whether to reveal or conceal them. Audiences later debated whether it was symbolic. Did the failing bulb represent instability, fragility, truth flickering at the edges of perception? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was simply a happy accident, the result of an old fixture the crew couldn't quite tame. Either way, it became unforgettable. One of the crew's favorite stories from production was about a shot that seemed impossible to achieve. The director wanted the camera to drift slowly through a room, circling the characters as if it were a ghost moving among them. But the set was too small for the rig they planned. For days, they tried solutions, tracks, drones, even digital tricks, but nothing felt right. Finally, a grip had the wild idea to strip the camera down to its barest form and hold it while lying flat on a rolling office chair. The crew pushed him slowly around the set while he craned upward, capturing the shot. It was crude, hilarious to watch, and unbelievably effective. When audiences saw it, they assumed it was an expensive, elaborate setup. In truth, it was office furniture and stubborn ingenuity. These choices, the raw locations, the natural light, the improvisations of camera movement, were more than aesthetic flourishes. They shaped the emotional texture of the film. When you watched, you didn't feel like you were observing a crafted stage. You felt immersed in a world already in motion, a world that didn't need you, but still allowed you to glimpse its secrets. That's rare. Most films try to control your gaze. This one invited you to wander, to notice, to feel the edges of the frame pressing with unseen stories. Thematically, this approach tied directly to the narrative's heart. The settings were never just backdrops. They were mirrors, amplifiers, foreshadowings. The ruined industrial site spoke of decay and abandonment, reflecting the character's inner unraveling. The forest suggested both refuge and danger, embodying the tension between freedom and entrapment. The urban neighborhoods reminded us of community and history, of lives layered upon lives. Every place resonated with what the characters carried inside them, as though the world itself was conspiring to tell the same story in parallel. What fascinates me most is how the smallest, quietest details often carried the greatest weight. The creak of a door, the flutter of curtains in a half-broken window, the way shadows bent across a character's face at just the right angle. All of it built a language beyond words. It reminded me that cinema, at its best, is poetry written in light and sound, where every detail has the potential to mean more than it says. And perhaps that's the magic of this film's settings and cinematic elements. They never stayed still. They breathed, they whispered, they warned, they mourned. They didn't just frame the story. They became it, stitching themselves into the fabric of character, theme, and emotion until you could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. If you've ever stood on a film set, you know there's a certain hum to it. Not just the literal whirring of cameras or the shuffle of cables being dragged across floors, but a hum of people, of collaboration, of chaos that somehow organizes itself into beauty. This production was no different. In fact, the behind-the-scenes world carried just as much drama, comedy, and tenderness as the story unfolding in front of the cameras. It began long before the first slate clapped. The cast and crew assembled weeks earlier for rehearsals, test shoots, and those long production meetings where ideas are thrown onto whiteboards, erased, rewritten, and argued over until everyone's coffee has gone cold. What struck me most was how quickly this group bonded. Some sets are notorious for tension, for egos clashing like cymbals, but here, there was a strange sense of family. Messy at times, imperfect but real. The director, known for his meticulous vision, surprised everyone with a playful side. He'd wander on his set humming songs or crack jokes right before a tense take, forcing actors to fight back smiles. One morning, when the schedule was running especially late and tempers were starting to fray, he walked in wearing a ridiculous, oversized sun hat he'd borrowed from wardrobe. He didn't say a word about it. He just gave notes, adjusted blocking, and carried on with complete seriousness, the hat bobbing with every step. It broke the tension instantly. People started laughing, shoulders loosened, and the day moved forward with a kind of buoyancy that had been missing. The actors, too, developed rituals to keep the energy alive. Between takes, they'd huddle over someone's phone to play word games or challenge each other with tongue twisters and character voices. One of the supporting actors became infamous for sneaking snacks into scenes. Tiny candies hidden in pockets, a granola bar palmed just before the cameras rolled. It drove continuity crazy, but became a running joke on set, with crew members placing small bets on whether he'd sneak something into the next take. Sometimes he'd offer a bite mid-scene, and the other actor, desperately trying to stay in character, would burst out laughing, ruining the shot. Annoying? Yes. But those moments gave the set a warmth that no amount of professional polish could have manufactured. Then there were the accidents that became blessings. One day, during a particularly intense sequence, a prop door that was supposed to close gently slammed shut with a thunderous bang. Everyone froze, assuming the take was ruined. But the director's eyes lit up. He insisted they keep rolling, weaving the unexpected noise into the scene's tension. Later, watching playback, the crew realized the moment carried a jolt of raw energy they could never have planned. It's now one of the most memorable beats in the finished film, born from nothing more than a faulty hinge. Of course, not every challenge wrapped itself up so neatly. The weather, for one, was merciless. Filming outdoors meant surrendering to the moods of the sky, and it seemed almost mischievously against them. One week, a carefully choreographed scene in the forest was washed out by sudden rain. Not a gentle drizzle, but a downpour that turned the ground into mud and shorted out lights. The crew scrambled, tarps flew up like sails, and actors huddled in coats between takes. Spirits sagged. But later, watching the storm footage, the director realized the rain gave the forest a primal, haunting energy. Instead of fighting it, they rewrote the sequence to embrace the storm, letting characters move through the wildness of nature as if it were another antagonist. What had felt like disaster became poetry. There was also the endless battle with equipment. Cameras jammed. A crane refused to operate on a critical day, forcing the team to rethink how to capture a sweeping overhead shot. Instead of rescheduling, a luxury they didn't have, the cinematographer devised a solution using a jury-rigged pulley system. It looked absurd, cobbled together with ropes, counterweights, and the sheer willpower of three grips who swore they were engineering geniuses. Against all odds, it worked. The shot that made it into the final cut looks fluid, elegant, almost effortless. If only viewers knew it was powered not by state-of-the-art tech, but by sweat, laughter, and a dash of desperation. Then there were the quieter, almost invisible struggles. Long hours frayed nerves. Fatigue set in. The line between personal and professional blurred when people hadn't slept properly in weeks. Yet somehow, those were also the moments when bonds deepened. A crew member would bring in homemade soup to share, or an actor would lend their trailer for someone who needed a nap. These weren't grand gestures, but they mattered. They reminded everyone that behind the machinery of production were human beings, taking care of one another. Perhaps the most surprising stories came from the smallest interactions. One extra, cast for just a single day, impressed everyone with his enthusiasm. Though he had no lines and spent most of his time in the background, he treated every moment as though it mattered. The lead actor later admitted that watching this extra's dedication reignited his own passion during a tough week. "He reminded me why we do this," he said. "That extra, whose name most won't remember, quietly left fingerprints on the film's soul." Not all surprises were pleasant. Midway through filming, a key set piece collapsed overnight. No one was hurt, but the carefully constructed structure, weeks of work, was unusable. For a day, panic reigned. Budgets were stretched thin, schedules were unforgiving. But rather than despair, the art department threw themselves into problem solving. They worked around the clock, rebuilding not the same set, but a leaner, more versatile version. The collapse, in hindsight, forced them to strip down unnecessary details and focus on what truly mattered. When filming resumed, the scenes flowed more smoothly, and the new design offered opportunities they hadn't anticipated. Adversity became innovation. And then, of course, there were the unplanned joys. Animals wandered into shots. Once a stray dog padded into frame during an emotional exchange. Instead of cutting, the actors simply incorporated it, offering a few unscripted gestures. The result was oddly perfect, a moment of natural levity that felt true to life. The dog became an unofficial mascot on set, spoiled with snacks and affection, though wranglers had to constantly keep him from stealing focus. The friendships that blossomed behind the scenes carried as much emotional resonance as anything in the script. The leads, despite wildly different personalities, developed a sibling-like bond, teasing each other between takes, but fiercely protective when one struggled. Crew members spoke later about how rare it was to see such genuine camaraderie, how it spilled into the performances, lending authenticity to relationships on screen. Looking back, what stays with me most are not the polished images that ended up in the final film, but the fragile, fleeting moments of humanity that unfolded when the cameras weren't rolling. The sound of shared laughter echoing through a night shoot at 3 a.m. The sight of grips and electricians building impromptu shelters against the rain. The quiet nods of encouragement between actors before stepping into emotionally draining scenes. These are the invisible threads that stitched the film together. In the end, the behind-the-scenes world wasn't just about solving problems or surviving challenges. It was about finding joy in imperfection, creativity in chaos, and solidarity in exhaustion. It was about people bound together by a common vision, stumbling and laughing and persevering until the impossible became possible. And maybe that's the greatest insight of all. Every film is a story, but every set is a story too. A story of how human beings come together against odds and obstacles to make something that will outlive them. If you've ever left a movie theater feeling like something has shifted inside you, even if you can't quite name what it is, then you've already brushed against the power of themes and symbolism. They're the hidden architecture of storytelling, the part of the film that you don't just watch, you absorb. This particular film, for all its spectacle and surface thrills, is stitched together with deeper layers of meaning that hum quietly beneath the narrative, like a pulse you can feel but not always see. And those layers are what make the story unforgettable. At its heart, the film wrestles with identity, what it means to truly know oneself in a world determined to define you. The protagonist's journey isn't just about surviving physical dangers or confronting external enemies. It's about peeling back the masks society has placed upon them, masks they've sometimes worn willingly, sometimes begrudgingly, and discovering what lies beneath. There's a universal ache in that struggle. Haven't we all, at one point or another, asked ourselves, am I who I think I am, or who the world insists I must be? That question threads through every scene like an invisible string, tugging both characters and viewers toward deeper reflection. The theme of power runs alongside this. Not simply power in the sense of weapons or armies, though those are certainly present, but power as a moral dilemma. Who has it? Who abuses it? Who resists it? And perhaps most hauntingly, what happens to the soul when one finally seizes it? The film never answers these questions neatly because life never does. Instead, it places characters in situations where power corrupts some, transforms others, and tempts all. Watching it unfold, I couldn't help but think of history's many cautionary tales, where noble intentions soured into tyranny, or where fragile humans became monsters under the weight of authority. Yet amidst these heavy themes, there's a quieter, more intimate current, the longing for connection. Time and again, characters reach out, not always with words, sometimes with small gestures, a glance, a sacrifice. The film insists that survival is not enough. One must find belonging, even in broken places. This longing becomes particularly poignant in the relationships between characters who, on paper, should be enemies, but who discover slivers of humanity in one another. Those moments of tenderness are like cracks of sunlight in a storm, reminding us that no matter how dark the landscape, there is always a stubborn thread of hope. Symbolism amplifies these themes in ways you might not catch on first viewing, but once you notice, you can't stop seeing them. Consider the recurring image of broken glass. It appears in subtle forms: shards scattered across a floor, a cracked mirror, the shattering of a window in a climactic moment. Glass becomes a metaphor for fragility, but also for reflection. Characters are constantly confronting fractured versions of themselves, glimpsing who they are in shards that don't quite fit together. It's a brilliant device because it works both visually and emotionally. Every time glass splinters across the screen, we're reminded that identity, like glass, is rarely whole. It is pieced together, vulnerable, and easily shattered by the pressures of the world. Another symbol that lingers is fire. Sometimes it burns as destruction, scenes engulfed in flame that consume homes, hopes, entire lives. But other times it glows